So for those who don't know me, I am Elizabeth Anderson and I'm the Interim Chief Executive here at the Digital Poverty Alliance. If you don't know the Digital Poverty Alliance, we are an organisation run by the Learning Foundation and established with support from the Institute of Engineering and Technology and Currys PLC, with the aim of ending digital poverty once and for all in the UK by 2030. We do this by bringing people together, whether they're from government, whether they're from business, whether they're from charities, whether they're from other arenas such as academia, to tackle the really complex determinants that sit behind and around digital exclusion. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Professor Simeon Yates. Simeon, could you say a few words about yourself?
More afternoon, actually, everybody. So I'm Simeon Yates. I'm Professor of Digital Culture at the University of Liverpool, and I have been doing different types of research projects around digital inclusion, exclusion, digital poverty, whichever terminology we want to use, for over 2 decades. But I'm here today to talk about our current research work, which is around setting a minimum digital living standard.
Fantastic. It's great to have so many people joining us here today. If you haven't already, because a couple of people have started to, please do say hello to us in the chat. Let us know who you are, what organisation you're representing, and whereabouts in the world you are. And if, as we go through the chat that we've got coming up with Simeon, you've got any questions, do pop them in the Q&A that's at the bottom of the screen. And then if we've got a little bit of time later in this session, we'll try and come to as many of those as possible. So don't be shy, do put your questions in. So, Simeon, the minimum standard of digital living. Tell us about it.
Right, I'm going to do the academic thing of just doing a few slides. We can't work without slides. I'm just going to walk through it, try and take just about 10 minutes, so I might rattle through this quite quickly. And then I know that Elizabeth's got a lot of questions for me, which we'll go through, and hopefully you may have too. So let me just do the sharing screen thing. Can I get some kind of thumbs up that that's looking right?
All good.
All good, right. So this is a project we're running at the moment. It builds on over 20 years, like I said, of different other projects with a whole range of organizations, local government, national government, and so on over the years. This is the team. I won't go through for the purposes of time, but it's people from the University of Liverpool, Loughborough, Good Things Foundation, which people will probably know as one of the national charities in this space, colleagues at City University in London, University College Dublin, and our commercial, or rather kind of professional research survey partner for doing national surveys, critical research. So what I say now comes from this team, not just from me. So if we think about digital inequality, there is a real question about what we measure, because what we need to be able to do is measure this reasonably well so that we can see if we're having an impact. And there are lots of different things you can measure. Don't you have a laptop, PC, whatever? Have you got broadband? What speed broadband have you got? What levels of digital skills or literacies might you have? You know, there's the essential digital skills framework. There's levels of use, like, you know, how much do you do various things, and so on. Different types of use. Are you mainly using it functionally? Are you using it for all aspects of your life? Do you use it for entertainment? Do you use it for doing politics, connecting with your MP or something or whatever? Benefits from use. What benefits do people gain from use? Do some people gain more benefits than others, etc.? Or does greater access lead to greater benefits? And conversely, harms. You know, who's more likely to be harmed by issues that may happen online? Are harms greater for different groups, etc., and so on? All of these things hold, but every single one of them kind of sits separately or in conjunction with the others. So which one is the important one to measure is a question. And secondly, and most importantly, to date, nearly all of these things has been measured in terms of individual people. Do you have digital skills? Do you have access to the internet? Whereas lots of qualitative work we do when we talk to households, talk to people, talk to different groups. We just finished a project that was published this week on survivors of modern slavery and their digital needs. Everybody always talks about doing digital in relationship to help from friends and family, working with others, doing things in the community, issues between children and parents, children's needs to be safe online, parent skills, etc. It's not an individual thing. So therefore, we did come to the conclusion, and I would say it was Emma Stone at Good Things who made the connection, that we needed to do more than an individual measure. We needed to look at household level, understand what it was a household needs, because the pandemic really brought that home, that a parent might tick all of the access boxes. So a single parent with a laptop and a games machine in the house, etc., might tick all the boxes. But with 2 kids under lockdown in the pandemic, 1 laptop was not enough. You need to look at the household as a whole. So Emma connected us in Liverpool up with the colleagues at Loughborough. The colleagues at Loughborough do research on what's a minimum income standard. So what's the amount of goods and services, food, facilities, whatever a household needs, such that it's a reasonable minimum and they can therefore participate in society. It is not survival. It's not enough food just to eat. It's enough to be engaged. And they've done this for over a decade. And they've demonstrated that households, families, individuals can come to really good, clear minimum requirements, not gold taps and caviar every day, but what is the minimum a household needs? The moment it goes below it, it starts to suffer various inequalities or lack of opportunities or consequences. And so we all got together and we decided to apply this idea to digital. What's the minimum set of digital kit, access, skills, community support, whatever, that a household needs, such that below which it starts to suffer the consequences of digital exclusion? It's not just a list of kit and broadband speeds, but there is a list of kit and broadband speeds in it, right? It's more than that, but that's in part of it. And also, most importantly, it's built by citizens, not by academics or policymakers looking down. So the Essential Digital Skills Framework is really, really useful, but it's essentially defined by academics, policymakers, and businesses. There are skills on our skill list that are not on the Essential Digital Skills list, which I'll show in a moment. So there we go. How did we do it? Because we're only halfway through the project. We've defined the standard. We're about to start measuring it with a national survey. We've done the field work, which has mostly been led by the colleagues in Loughborough. It's been funded by the Nuffield Foundation, which is a big social policy research funder, and Nominet. And if you know Nominet, they kind of run the .uk bit of the internet in Britain, and they do a lot of they're a non-profit and they do a lot of work with young people. So they've supported the young people component. We've done the field work to define the standard. We're about to do a national survey. Very fortunately, and quite wonderfully, the Welsh government has already decided before we finished that they want an MDLS for Wales. So they've commissioned us to do additional work in Wales and talk to Welsh stakeholders about how to use this in policy. So that's where we're at. I've said it's household level approach, etc., and so on, and it's built from discussions with whatever. So the first stage of all of these multiple discussions we've had with households was to define a verbal standard. So we've spoken to lots and lots of different types of households. This stage, all types of households, ones with kids, one without kids, older people, younger people, etc., on their own, together, living in different circumstances. Those groups, over a number of iterations, came up with this definition. A minimum digital standard of living includes, but is more than, having accessible internet, adequate equipment, and the skills, knowledge, and support people need. It is about being able to communicate, connect, and engage with opportunities safely and with confidence. So we then took that, which had come from those discussions, and put it through 3 more rounds of multiple focus group discussions. And it says 17 there, that's wrong. We can bring the Welsh ones in, it was 20. So 20 more discussions in 3 stages. The first stage was to take that definition and say, right, what do you need to meet it? And in this case, we're only looking at households with children because the funding only allows us to do households with children. We are hoping to expand it to other household types in the coming year. So to cover people living on their own, retired people, and so on. So get the breadth of household types. That set of task groups gave us a list of equipment, skills, etc., that a household would need. We then took that to another group of discussions that went round again, and these are all around the UK, not just in one place, but all around the UK nationally. And they checked those, critiqued them, tweaked them, whatever. Then we had a final groups just to say, yes, this looks good. So that was the process. What they came up with is 3 levels. One is digital goods and services. The other one is practical skills, so using those digital goods and services. And lastly, kind of skills for living in a digital society, managing digital risk, knowing how to operate safely in a digital world. This is the full definition, which is very hard to read on here, but I'm just going to rattle through the key components of it. First off, there's a set of equipment. There is a list of access and of digital equipment and broadband and so on. Key components are, though, broadband with sufficient reliability and speed to support all family members. It's not a number. It's not 67 megabit or 500 megabit or 2 megabit or 10 megabit, which is the national standard that's got to be achieved, etc., which is way inadequate. It's enough for the family all to cope. Second, access to a smartphone and data, assuming you've got broadband, not separate from, but assuming you've got broadband, with every parent and every secondary school age child having a basic entry-level smartphone and 5 gig of data each month. Then some extra data for parents if they've got preschool kids, because preschool kids can make demands on your phone that are in addition to yours, but they don't own one themselves. An entry-level laptop per household, so for the parents and first child, but for educational, school use, etc., an additional device, tablet or laptop, for every further school-age child. Headphones, because lots of people can't do digital in private, in homes, they're doing their homework at the table, they're listening to whatever. It allows people, especially school-age children, to engage with digital in shared spaces. Basic entry-level TV with an entry-level service subscription, Netflix, whatever, because without that, you are socially and culturally excluded. We have lots of evidence, say from the modern slavery thing, about the importance of having access to digital content for children, for their social lives outside of education, otherwise they suffer bullying and exclusion and so on. A smart speaker, because nobody wants a radio anymore. And also, there's all the parents say it's an important tool for children, especially younger children, to interact with things. It sits in the minimum income standard as well. That's what people want now instead of a radio. And lastly, going back to the point about social inclusion, a gaming console with a basic gaming subscription. Again, because all the children and the young people we talked to, because we had 2 groups that were with young people, in fact 3 groups, one in Wales, with young people between 13 and 18 to sense check what parents were saying. And they all said, without that, you are socially excluded. There's the 2 sets of skills, very practical skills, device functions, etc., and so on. And then more critical skills, evaluating misinformation, knowing you leave a digital footprint, evaluating friend requests, knowing how to be safe online. You'll notice a little color code of numbers against these. These were the agreed stages at which we thought a child, well, rather the families and the young people thought a child should achieve those skills such that they had them when they became an adult. So all adults should have all these skills, but children should acquire them at certain points. So that is our minimum digital living standard. The argument is a household that doesn't meet this or has got chunks of this missing will start to suffer some forms of digital exclusion compared to other households, such that aspects of modern society will not be available to them. And of course, the less of these things you have, the worse that gets. So I will flip through the next slides because they're the same thing said again. And it was the key point that lots of the families and the households we spoke to brought out was, if you don't have it all, then it breaks down. So if you don't have both the devices, the basic skills and the critical awareness, then how do you do your homework? Similarly, how do you access healthcare, etc.? As this person said, to have the accessibility, you need it all. So what we think it is, it's a nicely holistic definition. It's not just, have you got broadband? Or, not mentioning which, a civil servant in a government department in the UK recently said to me, isn't a SIM card enough? In response to some policy suggestions that we were making. It is about the fact that actually being digitally excluded is not just not having the wires in the ground. It's not having a set of things that allow you to function safely and with confidence, and to use an academic phrase from the stuff we do, to build a life that you value. We've started the survey work having done a preliminary test run to test the tool. The real field work starts this month. All is cleared on that. We've bound that up with a bit of Ofcom tech tracker data to have a first look. And we would estimate somewhere between 20 and 30% of UK households fall below this standard in some way, which, strangely enough, we're not really surprised by, because that kind of fits other analyses where, 25% of UK households are led by adults with limited digital skills or digital experience. Last thing we're going to do is take that into that national survey and map it. Here's an example of the kind of mapping tool we use, but on some other internet data, to see where in the country issues are greater or lesser around the minimum digital living standard. I will stop now. I was slightly more than 10 minutes, as I promised. Let me just stop sharing.
But well worth it. Thank you. That's a really fantastic introduction to the MDLS and the work that you've done. Do you think there were any particular unexpected challenges that came up when you were creating this and during the research process?
I'll go on to one around the survey in a minute. I think that the field work, obviously the Loughborough people led the field work. It was always an experiment. It was always an experiment whether the minimum income standards measure work would translate to a different domain, though we had evidence from their prior work on things like, minimum community environment needs, that it does translate as a method, but also that whether or not the households would be able to define a minimum, would know enough actually to be able to define a minimum. And they did very clearly were able to do that. So that, there was a really positive engagement with the definition and a lot of very thoughtful reflection on what is a minimum. So, like the tablet and laptop, they are, absolutely basic entry-level devices, probably devices that many of us on this call would find inadequate for our needs, because we have work needs and other needs that they would not be able to meet. But households said, but we think, because we've got one, it's enough for a child to do their homework, whatever. So it is a minimum in that sense. And yeah, and nobody was asking for 6 iPads, 2 iPhones, and a, whatever. They were thinking through very practically the needs. So I wasn't surprised by that, but it was very heartening that discussion, that deliberative process worked really well, and that they came up with some fairly concrete things. Some of the surprising things were things like, on the skills list, which I skimmed over, you will see things like ability to manage your data on your smartphone, to be able to turn it on and off, to be able to go and use Wi-Fi spaces, whatever, to eke it out over the month. Because lots of people who are probably below the minimum digital living standard, and certainly those levels might sound high, the 5 gigabytes or whatever, but once shared out and used and so on, they can get used up quite quickly. That and some of the other practical skills are not on the essential digital skills list. Because if you're planning that from a government skills for work perspective, that's not something you'd think about. So there were quite a few insights into how people keep themselves online who are at that kind of threshold of the minimum. The interesting challenge has been being able to try and develop a survey that is doable quickly, that gathers data on everybody in a household across all of those skills and all of those devices. Our first design was an hour and a bit long survey. Now, if we had lots of money, we could do that. Probably not great use for policymakers because, you know, great academic tool if you've got the money to do an in-house 1 hour long, 1 and a bit hour long thing. Probably drive the family mad asking the same questions again and again and again about different family members if they've got 4 kids, right? So we had to do quite a bit of work of looking at how those skills, correlate with each other. Which ones are the ones that kind of, if you've got that one, you've probably got the others. So we could boil the survey down into something doable. So it's an interesting thing in that it's a really good tool. You could use it to go and have a conversation with a household and in half an hour have a really good sense whether they met it or not. As a survey tool, we've had to tweak it a bit. But yeah, that's where we are now. And we've already started using it in other areas, like the work we've just done on survivors of modern slavery. Having this at the same time allowed us to really identify the massive gaps in support and provision that they had, that were not just about functionally engaging with the national referral mechanism, the mechanism that provides them with support, but the other aspects of their lives.
And are you starting to see government interest, maybe the Digital Skills Council, starting to pick up on some of these other skills?
Well, if I'm honest, obviously the Welsh government have already picked up on it. We've done phase 1 of that work with the Welsh government, which involved sense checking this with Welsh households, rural, urban, young people, which we've done, so we've done across Wales, but also talking to stakeholders in Wales about, well, if you had one of these, how would you use it? How would policy work with it? So we've just finished that work as well. That was published at the same time as the MDLS report. So if you go to the website, which I can share, both the Welsh and the national reports are there and you can compare them. For phase 2 in Wales, we're talking to some households in depth who are below the standard, and also doing some more stakeholder work about how you address the gaps. I mean, key thing, if you look in that definition, there's nothing about affordability, and there's nothing in there that says who should provide those skills, right? Because actually, if you can't afford it, that's a barrier to meeting it, not part of it. If there's nobody who can provide you with those skills in your community or your family network, that's a barrier to you achieving them, right? So as a policy tool, the question is, if people do not have these, what's the reason? Is it they can't afford it? Whatever. So as people may have heard me talk before, I mean, are social tariffs anywhere near what they need to be for people living on low incomes and in social housing? No, right? They're not meeting the affordability criteria. Therefore, they're not online. Therefore, they're not meeting this. So affordable. Or if you're in a rural Welsh village and you want to get some digital skills, well, it turns out you have to drive to the nearest town to go to a community centre where they've got a digital skills thing. If you can't drive, or if the buses are rubbish, that's a barrier to you getting those skills. So the policy intervention might be bringing the skills to you. So importantly, the standard doesn't say where do you get it from. It says what are the needs. And you look at the minimum income standards work, it sets a bar of food, facilities, services that household needs, right? It doesn't say who should pay for that. If your wages pay for it, fine. Does benefits pay for it? Does the minimum wage is nowhere near the minimum income standard, and the living wage is closer, but it informs those discussions about what they should be. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think it leads into a really interesting sort of point, and probably a whole separate debate around what do people absolutely critically have to have, and then actually what is a good standard. And I think that comes into what you were describing earlier with the minimum income standard. And we would say for so many people, millions of people remain completely offline, and we've got so far to get to in terms of actually where people should be.
Yeah.
You touched on how you're going to be building on this, and some of the mapping work that's happening, the work you've done in Wales. Presumably, I'm pretty sure I've heard that you're going to be also quite keen to work on other demographics of people who don't necessarily have children in the household. What's coming next? Can you tell us?
What's coming next? We've been talking to other regional parts of the UK about this, Scotland, Greater Manchester, Liverpool, and how we might build that into their policy work around digital inclusion, because they've all got it on their agenda. Yes, there's the mapping work and the survey work to build on. We do need to expand it to other household types, so we're looking to secure the resources to do that over the next year. I've already noticed in the chat a couple of questions about households with other demands and needs, such as a household where maybe there's a person who's disabled, or a household where maybe a child's got long-term ill health and other things. We're already getting contacts and talking to people about those. If you look at the minimum income standards work, what they usually do is take this households with children definition as a starting point, expand it to other basic household types, and then the idea is to write a standard for every single potentially variance of a household, but to say, well, if for it, because people with disabilities is a massive variety of people, from people with, very severe learning disabilities right through to people with sight issues, to people with hearing issues, mobility issues. It's not one thing, right? So if you take this as a start and you say, what are the things that you will need to meet that? Some of those things are not on that list, right? But at least it gives you that conversation to say, right, well, you need at least those and this to be equivalent to everyone else meeting the standard. So it's a tool for having that conversation, or for a charity or a government department to say, right, the people we deal with, where are they on this? What are the additional needs? So yes, but we are already in conversation around the growing use of digital in health, and so using this as a tool to say, right, here are a set of people who now need digital tools for health. A lot of the parents are in lower income circumstances. How do we get them up to a minimum such that they can actually engage with the digital health tools they're being expected to use with their child? So we think it's really good for having those conversations. And yeah, so that's the kind of thing we're wanting to do next. I can put it in. We are also running some workshops with people representing different stakeholder groups nationally. So we've just done one around people with disabled people. We're going to be running one on issues, things like first language not being English, recently migrant communities and so on. Another one around housing, and I think another one around health. I need to check the list over the next couple of weeks, where we're going to talk to charities, policy makers and others in those areas to say, right, how do you use this to help with your work and make it a tool you can use?
Amazing. And there's going to be so many people, and we can see this coming through in the chat now, so many people who are keen to be involved in these developing conversations. I could sit here and ask Simeon my own questions probably for the rest of the afternoon, and we have a large number coming through on the chat, on the Q&A function. So I'm going to start moving across to some of the questions from our audience. Jane Hopkins has asked whether there are geographical differences that you've seen and whether these map against other inequalities.
So we haven't done the mapping yet, so I can't say with any kind of certainty, but I would be surprised if not. If you look at some of the other measures I mentioned at the start of my introduction, access to broadband, number of laptops in a house, whatever, and so on, levels of internet use according to Ofcom measures and so on. The Northeast, if you talk about England, the Northeast is particularly struggling compared to the rest of the country. Areas of London are way ahead of the rest of the country, but then there's whatever we want to call them, cold spots in London. Rural is always an issue, but strange enough, there are also cold spots in cities, and it's to do with how we manage the installation of infrastructure. You can just as easily have 7 tower blocks in Rochdale with 0 internet access as you can a rural Welsh village, because the costs of bringing it to them and the legal issues are just as much as a rural Welsh village. So I absolutely expect there to be some regional variations. And I did see just flick past a question about, will we survey coastal towns because of the high levels of deprivation there? We're doing a nationally representative survey, so it can only touch on, kind of go down to a granular level so far, because you survey 2,000 people. I mean, some of them will be in rural areas, some of them will be in coastal areas, etc., but you won't be able to drill down. What we would hope, if from the clever geographic mapping we do, where we model the people and then we apply that model to tiny areas across the country, like street level areas, we'll get a good model of where things sit across the country.
Fantastic. And when you say across the country, do you mean across the whole of the UK?
Yes.
Brilliant. Which covers off one of the next questions that we had coming in. But it's really important and really interesting when you look at those differences between regions in England and then across different parts of other nations within the country as well.
I mean, importantly, we're in actual date, regular conversation with the Welsh government and the Scottish government and Greater Manchester and Liverpool on this in terms of policy making. You will note there's a government that's missing from that, because at the moment they don't seem to be wanting to talk about these things, but at a policy level. But with specific departments, DWP, HMRC and so on, we're having conversations around the value of this.
And much needed, extremely needed, to try and join up that government piece, because there's no clear ownership around many of these issues. Hannah Richmond has asked, are the MDLS standards on a spectrum? Are some harder to secure than others and require more intervention to achieve? Are there any to be focused on first?
Oh, I think that's definitely, because I mean, some of them are the classic ones we've always dealt with in digital inclusion, like, well, have you got broadband? Maybe a bit more practically difficult to achieve if you are highly remote, or like I said, you've got a tower block in the middle of Manchester with complex wayleaves and it was not designed for having the wiring pulled through it. Yeah, it can be difficult to achieve, but it's a specific practical type of task. Like with the minimum income standard, there's a question on how do people acquire the laptop or the gaming console, etc. We are not saying that governments should go handing out these devices, but what we are saying is, well, maybe households should have enough income to get these. And again, as all the households said, these do not have to be brand new, fancy new things. They could be gifts, they could be other things, but there's a question there about how the third sector and others support households to be included. The skills one is a fascinating one, because strange enough, all the households came to the conclusion that people should have these skills by the time they leave formal education, so by the time they're 18. So there is a question there about where this fits into national curriculum, where it fits into the role of schools. And that is a discussion that doesn't seem to be being had particularly well in the UK, especially England. There's more of a push on that kind of stuff in Wales, where they've redesigned curriculum, and a discussion on that in Scotland. But I would say, in fact, there was a discussion on that in Greater Manchester. But there is a question there about how do we ensure that people leave the education system, which is the only place we can really do that skills intervention, with those. If you look at the statistics, people who go to university predominantly have all of those skills. People who don't have all of those skills. So there's something about what the expectations at university, even though we're not teaching those explicitly, that people come out with them. So there's something in there. And so, yes, some of those are probably harder to deliver if you're not delivering them in an education context. You're delivering them in an adult ed post education context.
And of course, Wales and Scotland have strategies for digital inclusion in different ways. England and Northern Ireland still, on the whole, lacking, but of course, very strongly being campaigned for by the DPA. Jim Coppin has asked, is this or will this be incorporated into the index of multiple deprivation?
Oh, in my dreams. It would be a dream to have it folded into a national measure. I mean, the Welsh are talking about how we might fold this into, they have a number of national measures on this topic, and hence why we're doing the survey work. I think what will be interesting is how you might measure this alongside things like indices of multiple deprivation and see how the two play out next to each other. Because also households could not meet the minimum digital living standard by choice. They could be households who don't want to engage with digital technologies at all, and that's their choice.
Yeah.
But they won't necessarily be poor. Also, there may be older households that don't meet all of that, but they feel that they don't have so many negative consequences as a result, or they manage them in other ways. Again, they may not be in greater levels of poverty. But yes, it is supposed to sit there as a measure to be sat against other measures like deprivation, like education, health, and so on, to see the interplay between the two.
Yes, and there's so much interplay to be found. Hannah has come back with a second question. It's actually a really interesting point and something that we struggle to grapple with as we look towards 2030. How can we ensure that the standards evolve as technology evolves? She appreciates its early days research, but is it something you've been looking at and considering?
So what's interesting is some of it already is, I think, slightly future-proofed, in the sense that its statements, and this has come from the households themselves, not necessarily us, is, enough broadband for everybody in the house to be able to use it. So if everybody starts using FaceTime and Zoom 100% for everything, well, broadband speeds are going to have to catch up. So therefore, broadband speeds for a household with 5 people would be greater. Or if we get super fast broadband rolled out and everybody's got 500 or a gigabit, broadband speeds may no longer be one of the issues, but the definition is relative. I mean, similarly with things like an entry-level laptop and an entry-level smartphone, because they will keep moving. What we're really talking about is what is the most basic, or the most basic that's usable device on the market. So that's already, the families and the respondents have already essentially future-proofed that. I think things like the data levels for mobile phones, we've had to sort of be specific there. That would change, as might other things. The smart speaker comes from the fact that in the minimum income standards work, it started out as a radio, then it became a DAB radio, and then people said, what's the point of having a DAB radio? They're more expensive than Amazon Echo or whatever, or Dot or whatever, and I can do more with that, and it's cheaper. So as a minimum income standard for access to radio, maybe that's a better device, right? And so as technology changes, so what they do for the minimum income standards is every 3 to 5 years, they rebase the whole thing. So we would like to finish all the other household types, and then maybe in 3 years' time, just rebase it, go over everything again and look for what's changed. It would have to, I mean, all measures that are like that would need that. Yeah,
absolutely. And especially with technology, it does move so fast, and there's almost certainly things we cannot anticipate will exist in 2-3 years' time that everyone's going to want to get their hands on. You started talking about the speeds there, so I'm going to come to a question from Darren Roberts. who says, I know that we didn't want to put a numeric value against the speed for home broadband. However, given those devices listed for the digital goods and services, what do you think might be an estimated minimum if all of those devices are connected? Or is that an impossible question?
So way more than the current service standard, which is 10 meg, right? That is just nowhere near sufficient, right? Unless you've got just one person in the household, and then probably barely enough, right? And certainly not enough to maintain things like Zoom, multiple Zoom calls and all of that kind of thing. You might go, oh, you're not your super fast broadband sort of average, but your standard broadband average, which is like your 67 megabit type thing, right? That probably would work. And some of the technical people and the OpenReach people we've talked to have argued that that would be enough for what we've got in definition. Of course, what we found, and if you look at some other recent research on people in rural circumstances and so on, what people are sold and what they get are very different. You might be sold 67 megabit, but what you're actually being sold is somewhere between 33 and 67, right? If you get, I am literally 50 meters from the exchange, right? So when I had standard broadband and we were supposed to be on whatever it was, 120, I was clocking 150 some days, right? Because we were right by the exchange. In the last week or so, we have moved to super fast and I've got just the basic 500 package. Yeah, I am supposed to get 500. I'm clocking 550 something because I'm by the exchange. When we lived in a more rural area, on the edge of a rural area, we could barely get anything, but we were paying for X. So it's a really hard thing to say because the difference between what the market sells, what people actually get in their house, and then you add thick Victorian stone walls with iron orbits in them and your Wi-Fi box, and what people have actually got when they sat at the desk is a different thing. So I was kind of glad the families didn't go down to setting a number. But what I would say definitively is the current national minimum service standard is way below what's required.
Yes, and I have frequently experienced that drop off, as you say. I have a relative who I stay with a fair amount, supposedly on a very high download speed. It's sometimes below 1 megabyte, and you go, how is this possible? We've got a few questions about how you defined and decided on which families were going to be included. Could you touch on just generally how that population was chosen and how the
what was done there is, I believe, that was managed by the Loughborough colleagues. We used a national sampling organization and we gave them a framework of the economic backgrounds and locations and household types that we wanted to speak to, and they did the usual kind of randomized recruitment process. So we weren't just talking to a couple of families from a community centre or something. It was a nationally recruited thing. These were quite long workshops. They were like 3 hour long. They were long things.
Yeah.
So they were people who were formally recruited through, as you would for a survey or other kind of academic research. So, and they were in locations all around the UK, Scotland, Wales, an additional work in Wales on top of that, London, Northeast, etc. The Midlands. They were a broad set of locations.
Fantastic. And Sam Milson has asked another question about the participation in those groups. Did the research look at barriers such as English as a second language, proximity to support services, cultural barriers, and did it take into account those sort of other factors that don't immediately seem relevant?
So if you get the longer version of the presentation, there's a lot of quotes from households about what they thought the barriers to meeting this were. So that was discussed with them as we were discussing what these things would be, or it came up in the conversation. That's also written up in the report, so you can find some of that in the report. And then specifically in Wales, we both asked the stakeholders, so people like third sector organisations working with disabled people or working with kids in education or whatever, what the policy implementation barriers might be to this. So yes, that came up. But as I said earlier, we've not built that into the standard because they become then things to solve rather than, because the very, very, very first definition included the word affordability. And we ended up having quite a long conversation about that because the families had, or the respondents had put it in. But the more we reflected on it, that becomes problematic, because if somebody gave you all that equipment for free, you would be included. Yeah.
Yeah.
You didn't need to afford it. If you can't afford it, that's a barrier to it rather than it itself. So when we were having those conversations, and when, you know, so for instance, Welsh respondents talked about the need for lots of things to be in the Welsh language more than they currently are, especially commercial services, because essentially primarily Welsh speakers are excluded. We already know that people with lower literacy, second language or third or fourth language, English, whatever, struggle with digital inclusion. So those are issues to be addressed, and they certainly were brought up by participants and stakeholders.
Sure. And we have a number of questions that kind of sit around a similar theme of, will introducing the MDLS potentially lead to overdependence on digital technology, or presumption that people have that access and there's a bias towards creating digital defaults? Or do you think that it's actually more of a tool, especially once you get to the mapping, of helping policymakers realise that's not the case yet?
So I think one of the potential policy impacts is, if we've got a minimum digital living standard, which it defines both technologies and basic skills, then government services and also commercial services maybe should be designing for that, and not the assumption everybody's got a high-end iPhone, right? So, because I always make out the point, and I've made this in evidence to the House of Lords and other things, that if you're a commercial operator, you can design a nice fancy interface. If a number of people can't access your services due to cost or the nature of the interface, or the fact that they require more services than you want to provide, well, you can just make the business decision not to have those, to engage those people, or to put prices on those things that they choose not to pay, right? So you're not denying them access, but you're saying you cost more, so whatever. Government can't do that. Government can't say, well, you can't have universal credit if you don't have digital skills. You can't have universal credit if you don't have a laptop. You know, you can't access health service if you don't have. But we are at the point now where it's no longer free to get access to many bits of healthcare, because you've got to have a device by which you can book an appointment, etc., and so on. So, you know, free at the point of service. You know, you might say, well, you used to have to be able to drive there, but then there's a public bus, you know what I mean? There's an interesting, so there's something in there about using this as a baseline for service design. Whether we'd ever close that door on everything going digital by default now at this point in time, I think that horse has long since bolted from whatever. And there are lots and lots of good reasons for providing digital services, not just cost and so on. I think the issue is implementation, and that's where it all falls down. It's great to say we could do all these fancy things if it was digital, but then we don't do the fancy things, we do the cheap thing, and it's not very good, and then people can't get access. And we don't have a backup for when there's a problem. But yes, you could argue that if we got all of the UK to that basic minimum digital living standard, everybody, that there'd be a government position that said, well, everybody's at that now, so we can really, really shift to digital. But that would be the assumption that you could get people to that and keep them there. And I think we're into the politics and the policy here in it. We just want to be able to get people to stop thinking about digital inclusion as, does somebody having a wire in the ground and an iPhone, and then we leave them alone and walk away. Yeah.
And that's the really critical point. there are many and varied issues around digital poverty, and this is what digital poverty seeks to do. We're looking to bring together thinking around all of the different barriers. So devices and connectivity are actually, in our definition, only one determinant of digital poverty. We then look at skills, we look at accessibility and online safety, we look at technical support, and we look at the motivation and confidence to get online. And it's a hugely complex picture. And for those of you who aren't familiar, do go to digitalpovertyalliance.org, look at our national delivery plan, which you'll find on the homepage, and that will probably start to touch on actually a number of the questions that are starting to come up. Roger has pushed back a little. He doubts that some of the elements apply to a realistic minimum. Is not having Netflix really a fundamental deficit? I can declare I don't have Netflix myself. Do you think that that is skewing the MDLS at all, or do you
I think we need to be really careful about what we mean by a minimum here, and I'm going to push back against Roger. If you look at the minimum income standards, it will say things about having enough income such that you've got the mobility that you need, whether that's ownership of a car or use of public transport, etc., to be able to engage in society. We are not talking a minimum here that's just enough. I mean, the thing in the minimum income standard is they get critiqued. Oh, why have you got a television in there? Why have you got this in there? And their point is, right, we're not talking about a minimum so that people don't starve, because that basically is a very, very minimal food bank and no other food. You know, it's not a minimum income standard such that you're not dead tomorrow. And there's a minimum digital living standard. It's not a minimum such that you've just got enough to fill in your universal credit form and, you know, book a doctor's appointment. It's a minimum such that below which consequence follow. As to the Netflix thing, I'll give you an example from our Survivors of Modern Slavery. One of the first examples that was like a case study presented to us when we were putting the proposal together was from a charity that works directly with women who have been trafficked. I leave you to think about why the women have been trafficked. Rescued from those circumstances with a child, right? Lockdown happens. They've got 1 gig of data on a smartphone. They are told to do their counselling, psychology counselling support on the smartphone. They use up all their data in one counselling session. They have no contact with anything. Their child's got no whatever. The child is in school, right? So when, you know, they get provided with a dong, some data and a tablet. They're not meeting our minimum digital living standard at this point, right? When asked what were the benefits of having the tablet, the first answer was not, I can do my counselling session or I can get onto services. It was, my child has got access to like CBeebies content. They can watch that. When they go into school, they don't get bullied, right? It's about a minimum living standard. It's not a minimum survival standard, and it's not a minimal standard such that you can be functional as far as the state's concerned. It's to live a very basic life you value, so that your child is included and you are included. So though many of us might say, well, Freeview BBC is more than enough, it's not if that's all you've got and you end up bullied at school, or you can't talk to people at work, or the content you want to watch, which isn't in English, is not on BBC. So that was what we say, a basic subscription package, right? Choose your pick. It could be the BBC, which is free, or it could be Netflix that's got other language content on it, right? That's the way it's supposed to work, is to get you to that. You're fine. You know, maybe that's the phrase. And that's why it's a minimum, because below it, consequences follow. And above it, hopefully they don't.
And it's something we see ourselves in our work, or particularly where we run delivery projects and people share with us about what difference it's made having access to online or having access to a laptop. And on a personal sort of emotional level, I actually find it really sad that so many parents come forward and say, my child was being bullied, but now it's changed for whatever reason. And I think this is almost a hidden side of digital poverty and digital exclusion.
I mean, I would point to, I think it's fantastic. I don't people know the work that Kat Dixon's done. It's one of the good things, Digital Poverty Whatever fellows. She talked to so many different organizations about what they were supporting people with to be digitally included, which aspects of life, that she really struggled to visualize it. So she's created this table of elements, you know, like the chemical elements, that has different areas of life, health, community, entertainment, whatever. And below it are boxes, which are now predominantly done digitally. And it's a huge table, right? So you just start to realize the moment people don't have digital access or skills, you can start putting crosses through some of these boxes. And if you said to yourself, could I live without all of these boxes? You'd start to say, whoa, that's quite a lot of living that is now, if not impossible, more difficult because you don't have digital.
And a real impact on people's lives. We are going to need to wrap this up, and we have so many more questions yet to come. But what I would say is we have our community hub, which you can join if you go to digitalpovertyalliance.org. We will see whether we can create a space on there where we can get some of these questions and keep some of this debate going. And if Simeon has time, maybe he can share some of his insights on some of these as well.
And also very happy for people to contact me at the University of Liverpool if there's something really specific you want to contact me about. There's only one Simeon Yates at the University of Liverpool. If you search for Simeon Yates and you get the man who runs a brass band, that's not me. The other one.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great offer. Thank you, Simeon. Let's definitely keep this conversation going. I know that people are very excited to see where this goes next. Of course, your funding has focused on families with children. I know that you want to hit the other household types. So it's going to be very interesting actually to see what those differences are in some of those minimum standards. As we close up, do keep yourself up to date on what the DPA is doing. As I say, you can visit our website, digitalpovertyalliance.org, where you can join the hub, and you can also read our national delivery plan, which we published last month at the House of Lords. This contains a number of actions over a phased number of years as we work towards 2030 to really tackle some of the complexity around raising awareness, around research, but also about raising local capacity, the affordability of devices and connectivity, and also how we build skills and tackle accessibility and online safety. So there's a lot in there. More importantly, when you've looked at that, please do consider if there's anything that your organisation might be able to do. We've got a range of actions on there. Every conversation helps, every pledge helps. So please do consider pledging to take action on digital poverty today. Thank you so much for joining, and we will let you know when our next webinar is. Thank you so much, Simeon. It's been a really interesting session.
No problem. Thank you.